The old man's hands trembled as he stared at the photograph. Black and white, grainy, taken 73 years ago. Two young boys smiled at the camera, arms around each other, unaware that in less than 24 hours, one of them would vanish from the earth. The boy on the left, the smaller one, with the gap-toothed grin, would become a ghost. A name whispered in hushed tones. A mystery that would consume an entire family for 3/4 of a century. The boy on the right, the older brother, would spend every day of his life drowning in guilt, replaying one afternoon in his mind like a broken film reel, torturing himself with the same question: why didn't I save him? But here's what makes this story different from every other missing child case you've ever heard. Here's why you need to listen to every word I'm about to tell you. That little boy, the one who disappeared, he wasn't dead. He was alive, living a completely different life under a completely different name, with absolutely no memory that he'd ever been anyone else. No memory of his real mother who searched for him until her dying breath. No memory of the brother who carried his disappearance like a stone around his neck for 73 years. And the only reason anyone discovered the truth? A woman took a DNA test. For fun. During a pandemic. Just out of curiosity. And what she found destroyed everything everyone thought they knew about reality. This is the story of Luis Armando Albino. 6 years old. Stolen from an Oakland park in broad daylight. And found, alive, 7 decades later, living the life that was never supposed to be his. This is Buried Secret Media, and what you're about to hear will make you question everything you think you know about missing person cases, about identity, about how someone can be two different people at the same time. This is the longest-running missing child case in American history that ended with the victim found alive. And the way it was solved? It sounds like fiction, but I promise you, every word is true. Before we dive into this rabbit hole, if you're someone who loves true crime with impossible twists, mysteries that refuse to stay buried, and stories that prove reality is stranger than anything Hollywood could create, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling me if you've ever taken a DNA test and what you found, and subscribe to Buried Secret Media with notifications on, because I guarantee you've never heard another story like this one. Now, let me take you back to February 21st, 1951, to a sunny Wednesday afternoon in Oakland, California, to the moment when a single decision would fracture reality into two separate timelines and trap a little boy in the wrong one for 73 years. Are you ready? Because once you hear what happened, you'll never look at a playground the same way again. 23 minutes. That's how long it took for a 6-year-old boy to disappear from a public park in the middle of the afternoon while his 10-year-old brother watched helplessly. 23 minutes to destroy a family. To create a mystery that would haunt a police department for 7 decades. To steal not just a child, but an entire life. Let me paint you the picture. West Oakland, California. Brush Street Park. February 21st, 1951, approximately 3:45 in the afternoon. The sun is warm, but not hot. California winter, which means it feels like spring anywhere else in the country. Kids everywhere. Swings creaking. Mothers gossiping on benches. The playground sounds you'd hear in any American neighborhood in the 1950s. Two brothers are playing in the sandbox. Luis Armando Albino, 6 years old, small for his age, with dark hair and eyes that still held that pure, uncomplicated trust that exists before the world teaches you to be afraid. And Roger Albino, 10 years old, tall for his age, protective of his little brother in the way that oldest siblings are when they've been told 1,000 times, "You're responsible for him." The Albino family had immigrated from Puerto Rico just 1 year earlier. 6 kids total. Father working whatever jobs he could find. Mother, Antonia, trying to raise those 6 kids in a country where she didn't speak the language and didn't understand the customs. They were poor, struggling, but they were together. They were safe, or so they thought. Luis and Roger spoke mainly Spanish at home. Their English was broken, elementary school basic. But on the playground, language didn't matter. They were just kids, happy, playing, existing in that golden bubble of childhood where the worst thing that can happen is skin knee or going home when you're not ready. Here's what you need to understand about 1951. There was no concept of stranger danger. None. Kids walked to school alone, played outside unsupervised until the streetlights came on, talked to neighbors, shopkeepers, any adult who seemed friendly. The idea that an adult might harm a child wasn't something parents warned about, because it simply didn't happen, or at least, people didn't think it happened. So when the woman approached them, and this is the moment, right here, where everything changes, neither boy thought twice about it. She was in her early 30s, medium height, medium build, the kind of face you'd forget instantly, the kind of person who could blend into any crowd and disappear without a trace. But there was one thing Roger would remember for the rest of his life, one detail that would haunt his dreams for 7 decades. She wore a bandana, tied over her hair. Green, Roger thought. Though 73 years later, after replaying the memory 10,000 times, he could never be certain if it was green or red or some other color entirely. The woman knelt down to their level and spoke to them in perfect Spanish. Not textbook Spanish. Not accented Spanish. Native Spanish. The Spanish of someone who'd grown up speaking it. For these 2 little boys, struggling every day in an English-speaking world, this was like finding water in a desert. Hola, niños, she said, smiling. ¿Cómo están? Luis lit up immediately. Here was an adult who spoke their language, who sounded like home. Roger was more cautious, but even he felt that pull. That comfort of hearing your native tongue in a foreign place. The woman asked friendly questions. What are your names? How old are you? Where do you live? Do you like this park? Normal questions. The kind any friendly adult might ask children. Nothing threatening. Nothing that raised alarm bells. Just a nice lady being nice to kids. And then came the offer. ¿Quieren dulces? Do you want candy? Luis's eyes went wide. Of course he wanted candy. What 6-year-old wouldn't? The Albino family couldn't afford luxuries. Candy was something special. Something rare. Something that appeared only on birthdays or holidays if they were lucky. The woman smiled wider. If you come with me, there's a store just a few blocks away. I'll buy you candy. Whatever you want. As much as you want. Luis was already on his feet, bouncing with excitement. Roger hesitated. Something felt wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not danger wrong. Just off. That instinct that sometimes whispers in the back of your mind that something isn't right, even when you can't explain why. But before Roger could voice his concerns, before he could say, let's ask Mom first, or maybe we should go home, the woman took Luis's hand. Gently, not forcefully, not in a way that would alarm any of the parents sitting on nearby benches. Just a woman holding a child's hand. The kind of thing you'd see 100 times a day in any park. Nothing suspicious. Nothing worth noticing. Come on, she said softly. The store isn't far. And Luis, trusting and innocent and 6 years old, went with her. Roger followed. Not because he wanted candy anymore. That uneasy feeling in his gut was growing stronger with every step, but because he couldn't let his little brother go alone. Their mother would kill him if he came home without Luis. He was supposed to watch him. Supposed to keep him safe. They left the park. Nobody noticed. Why would they? It just looked like a mother walking her children home. Happens 1,000 times a day in parks across America. Nothing to see here. But with each block they walked, Roger's fear grew. This wasn't the way to any store he knew. They were heading away from the shopping district, away from their neighborhood, into an area that felt unfamiliar and wrong. After 2 blocks, Roger stopped walking. His heart was pounding. His instincts were screaming. Every nerve in his 10-year-old body was telling him this was wrong. 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 Excuse me, he called out in Spanish, his voice small and uncertain. Where's the store? You said it was close. The woman glanced back. Her smile had changed. It was thinner now, colder. Her eyes weren't friendly anymore. Just a little farther, she said curtly. Keep up. But Roger didn't keep up. He stood there on that sidewalk, frozen, watching as the woman pulled Luis along faster now, not bothering to hide her urgency anymore. And Roger had to make a choice. A choice that no 10-year-old should ever have to make. A choice that would define the rest of his life. He could follow them, could run after them, grab Luis, try to pull him away. But he was 10. She was an adult. What if she was stronger? What if she hurt him? What if both of them ended up taken? Or he could run home, get his mother, get help, get adults who could actually do something. I'm going to get Mom, Roger shouted, his voice cracking with fear and desperation. Maybe he hoped the threat would scare her into stopping, that she'd realize she was caught and let Luis go. But the woman didn't stop, didn't even look back. She just kept walking, faster now, pulling Luis around a corner and out of sight. Roger ran. He ran faster than he'd ever run in his life. His lungs burned. His legs ached. Tears streamed down his face. He ran past neighbors who stared at him in confusion. Ran past cars and houses, and everything blurred together because all he could think was, I have to get help. I have to save Luis. I have to fix this. He burst through the front door of their home, gasping for breath, sobbing, trying to explain to his mother what had happened. The words tumbled out in a panicked jumble. Mama, a woman, at the park. She spoke Spanish. She had a bandana. She said candy. She took Luis. She took him, Mama. I tried to stop her, but she was too fast. I came to get you. We have to go back. We have to find him. Antonia Albino was 33 years old, a mother of 6, a woman who'd crossed an ocean to give her children a better life. And in that moment, when her oldest son came running in without his little brother, when she saw the terror on Roger's face, she understood with the horrible clarity that only a mother can feel. Something terrible had happened. She didn't waste time on questions. Didn't stop to grab a coat or shoes or anything. She just ran. Out the door, down the street. Roger struggling to keep up behind her, both of them screaming Luis's name. Neighbors heard the screams and came outside. What's wrong? What happened? Someone called the police. Others joined the search, running toward the park, calling out for a little boy they'd never met, but suddenly felt desperate to find. When Antonia reached the park, the sun was starting to set. The swings moved gently in the breeze, but no one was on them. The sandbox was empty except for scattered toys. Other children were packing up, heading home for dinner, oblivious to the tragedy that had just unfolded. Antonia grabbed strangers by their arms, her Spanish rapid and desperate, tears streaming down her face. Mi hijo, have you seen my son? Un niño pequeño. 6 years old. Dark hair. He was with a woman. Please, please, have you seen him? A teenage girl remembered seeing something. Yeah, I saw a lady walking with a little boy about 20 minutes ago. But I thought he was her son. He wasn't crying or anything. Just walking with her. I didn't think anything was wrong. 20 minutes. Luis had been gone for 20 minutes. 20 minutes during which he could have been taken anywhere. Put in a car. Taken to a house. Driven out of the city. 20 minutes that might as well have been a lifetime. Antonia collapsed to her knees in the empty sandbox where Luis had been playing an hour earlier. The sound that came out of her was barely human. Not a scream. Not a cry. Something deeper and more primal than that. The sound of a mother whose child has been ripped away. The sound of a heart shattering in real time. Roger stood beside her, frozen, his face pale, his hands trembling. And in that moment, at 10 years old, a burden settled onto his shoulders that he would carry for the next 73 years. This was his fault. He'd let Luis go. He'd run for help instead of stopping her himself. He'd failed to protect his little brother. It didn't matter that he was just a child. It didn't matter that he'd done exactly what any reasonable person would have done in that situation. All Roger knew was that he'd been responsible for Luis. And Luis was gone. Night fell on Oakland. What had started as a sunny afternoon of play had transformed into every parent's worst nightmare. And somewhere, miles away, already unreachable, a 6-year-old boy named Luis Armando Albino was being carried into a life that was never meant to be his. A life that would erase everything he'd been and replace it with someone else entirely. The ghost story had begun, and it would take 73 years, a global pandemic, and a 63-year-old woman's curiosity about her ancestry to finally end it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because before we get to the miracle, we need to understand the horror. The decades of searching. The mother who refused to give up. The police investigation that went nowhere. The cold case that everyone assumed would never, ever be solved. And we need to understand what happened to Luis. Where he went. Who he became. The parallel life he lived while his real family searched for him, prayed for him, and never, ever stopped believing he would come home. So stay with me, because what comes next is going to break your heart. But I promise the ending? The ending is going to put it back together in a way you never saw coming. The Oakland Police Department received the call at 6:47 p.m. on February 21, 1951. A frantic woman, barely coherent, speaking rapid Spanish about a missing child. A neighbor translating, trying to explain, a boy was taken from a park. A woman with a bandana. Promised candy. The mother is hysterical. The brother witnessed it. They need help. Now. 2 patrol cars arrived at the Albino home within 12 minutes. The officers walked into chaos. Antonia pacing the tiny living room, praying in Spanish, clutching a photograph of Luis like it was the only thing tethering her to sanity. Roger sitting on the couch, staring at nothing, his face the color of ash. Neighbors crowded into every available space, some trying to comfort Antonia, others trying to get details from Roger. Everyone talking at once in a mixture of English and Spanish that created a wall of incomprehensible noise. Officer James Mitchell, 15 years on the force, took one look at the scene and knew this was bad. Really bad. But there was a problem. A big problem. Antonia didn't speak English. Roger's English was elementary school basic at best. And in 1951 Oakland, Spanish-speaking police officers were about as common as unicorns. Officer Mitchell tried to take a statement, tried to understand what had happened. But the language barrier turned a simple witness interview into a nightmare of miscommunication and frustration. What did the woman look like? Mitchell asked Roger through a neighbor who was translating. She had a bandana. Green, I think. Or red. She spoke Spanish. How tall was she? Roger looked confused. How was a 10-year-old supposed to judge an adult's height? Tall? I don't know. Adult tall. What was she wearing? Clothes? Roger's voice rose in panic. I don't remember. I don't know. I was scared. I just remember the bandana, and that she spoke Spanish and she took Luis. The more questions Officer Mitchell asked, the more agitated Roger became. The translation was slow, imperfect. Details were lost. And with each passing minute, Luis was getting farther away. Mitchell's partner, Officer Robertson, pulled him aside. You thinking what I'm thinking? Mitchell nodded grimly. Kid made up a story. Got scared because his brother wandered off. Invented the kidnapper to cover his ass. That's what I'm thinking too, Chin agreed. I mean, think about it. Stranger abduction? In broad daylight. From a public park? With witnesses around? That doesn't happen. Kids get lost. They wander away. They fall in creeks or get hit by cars. They don't get snatched by strange women offering candy. That's stuff from fairy tales. But then Mitchell looked at Antonia. At the raw, primal terror on her face. At the way she clutched that photograph like it was a religious icon. And he thought about his own kids at home. About how he'd feel if one of them vanished. All right, Mitchell said. Let's treat this as a genuine abduction until we know otherwise. Better to overreact than underreact. By 8 p.m., every available Oakland police unit was mobilized. Patrol cars cruised through the streets around Brush Street Park, spotlights sweeping into alleys and backyards and dark corners where a child might be hidden. Officers knocked on doors, showing residents a photograph of Luis, asking if they'd seen anything unusual that afternoon. Most people hadn't seen anything. It had been an ordinary Wednesday. Kids playing, adults working, dinner cooking. Nothing noteworthy until the police showed up asking questions. But a few people remembered fragments. A woman walking with a small boy, heading away from the park. Nothing suspicious about it at the time. The boy wasn't crying, wasn't struggling. Just a mother and son, probably heading home. But yes, now that you mention it, the boy might have matched the description. And yes, the woman might have had something on her head. A scarf? A bandana? Hard to say for certain. These vague half-memories gave investigators a direction, but not much else. They canvassed a 6-block radius, then expanded to 9 blocks, then 12. They questioned bus drivers, taxi operators, anyone who might have transported a woman and child that afternoon. They sent officers to the train station and the ferry terminal with Luis's photograph, asking staff to watch for anyone matching the description. Tips started coming in almost immediately. The local radio stations picked up the story, and the phone lines at the police station lit up like a Christmas tree. Someone thought they saw a boy matching Luis's description in San Francisco. Someone else swore they spotted him at a playground in Berkeley. Someone else was certain they'd seen him getting into a car in downtown Oakland. Each tip had to be investigated. Each one had to be checked out, followed up, eliminated. It was exhausting, painstaking work. And every false lead felt like a punch to the gut because it meant more time wasted, more time Luis was out there, more time for something terrible to happen to him. By midnight, a new and horrifying possibility had to be considered. The water. San Francisco Bay was less than a mile from Brush Street Park. The Oakland waterfront was lined with docks and piers, many of them in disrepair, with gaps in the fencing and easy access to the dark, frigid water below. If Luis had somehow gotten disoriented after being taken, if he'd managed to escape from the woman and then wandered toward the water, if he'd fallen in. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but everyone was thinking it. They needed to search the bay. The U.S. Coast Guard was contacted in the early hours of Thursday morning. By sunrise, Coast Guard vessels were patrolling San Francisco Bay and its tributaries, looking for any sign of a small body. Divers went down into the murky water around Jack London Square and the Port of Oakland, checking around pilings and wreckage, anywhere a child's body might have gotten trapped or snagged. It was grim, horrible work. The kind of search that makes hardened Coast Guard officers go home and hug their own children a little tighter. But it had to be done. They had to know. For 3 days, the Coast Guard searched and found nothing. No body, no clothing, no evidence that Luis had ever been near the water. For Antonia, this was simultaneously a relief and a fresh torture. If they didn't find him in the bay, it meant he might still be alive. But if he wasn't in the water, where was he? Where could her little boy have gone? The not knowing was worse than anything. Worse than grief, because at least grief has an object. You know what you're mourning. But this was grief mixed with hope, mixed with terror, mixed with confusion, all churning together into something that felt like going insane. Antonia didn't sleep. Couldn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table all night, every night, rosary beads moving through her fingers like a metronome, praying in whispered Spanish. Neighbors brought food that nobody ate. Coffee went cold in cracked mugs. The house felt like a shrine to absence. Roger sat beside his mother, unable to speak, unable to cry anymore, just staring at the wall and replaying those 23 minutes over and over in his mind like a film stuck on repeat. What if he'd grabbed Luis's hand and run? What if he'd screamed for help right there in the park? What if he'd done literally anything except leave his brother with that woman? The what-ifs would eat at him for the next 73 years. Therapists would later call it survivor's guilt mixed with childhood trauma. But Roger just called it what it was, knowing he'd failed his little brother when it mattered most. Thursday morning brought reinforcements. Word had spread through the community, and volunteers started showing up at the Albino home, offering to help search. Local Puerto Rican families, church groups, veterans, organizations, anyone who heard about a missing child and felt compelled to do something. The Oakland PD organized the volunteers into search parties, each team covering a different section of the city. They walked through parks and playgrounds, calling Luis's name. They searched vacant lots and construction sites. They checked drainage ditches and storm drains, and anywhere a child might be hidden or hiding. And then the U.S. Army got involved. There was a military base nearby, Oakland Army Base, and when soldiers stationed there heard about the missing boy, dozens volunteered to join the search. By Thursday afternoon, over 100 soldiers in uniform were methodically combing through West Oakland, treating it like a military operation. Search grids, systematic coverage, professional discipline. If Luis was in Oakland, they would find him. They had to find him. But Thursday passed with no sign of Luis. Then Friday. The search area expanded to 15 blocks, then 20, then 25. Dogs were brought in, hoping they might pick up a scent. But the dogs just ran in circles, confused by the multitude of scent trails in a densely populated urban area. By Saturday, the awful truth was starting to sink in. Luis wasn't in Oakland anymore. He couldn't be. With this many people searching this thoroughly, they would have found him by now, which meant the woman had taken him somewhere else. Immediately. Before anyone even knew he was missing. By car? By bus? By train? If she'd gotten him out of the city within an hour of taking him, he could be anywhere in California by now. Anywhere in the country. The thought was paralyzing. The FBI was contacted. Kidnapping across state lines was a federal crime. And while they didn't know for certain that Luis had been taken across state lines, they couldn't rule it out either. FBI agents arrived and took over the investigation, bringing resources and expertise that the Oakland PD didn't have. Luis's photograph was distributed to police departments across California, then across the western United States, then across the entire country. His description was sent to hospitals, orphanages, children's homes, anywhere a lost or abandoned child might turn up. But nothing. No leads. No sightings. No trace of Luis Albino anywhere. The newspapers covered the story extensively in those first few weeks. The Oakland Tribune ran it on the front page. Missing boy search continues. No trace of abducted child. Family's desperate hope. Luis's school photograph appeared again and again. That same picture of him grinning gap-toothed at the camera. completely unaware that this image would become the public face of his disappearance. The articles described the massive search effort, hundreds of volunteers, military involvement, Coast Guard operations. They quoted police officials saying they were following every lead, though privately, the officials were starting to lose hope. They interviewed neighbors who described the Albino family as hardworking and loving and completely devastated. And they printed Roger's description of the kidnapper, hoping someone might recognize her. A woman in her 30s, Spanish-speaking, wearing a bandana, either green or red, medium height, medium build, an unremarkable face, the kind of person you'd pass on the street and forget instantly. Tips continued for weeks. Every time someone saw a woman with a child, every time someone heard Spanish being spoken, every time someone noticed anything even slightly unusual, they called the police. And every tip led nowhere. It was like the woman and Luis had been erased from existence. Like they'd stepped through a door into another dimension and closed it behind them. By late March, the massive search operation scaled back. The soldiers returned to base. The Coast Guard resumed normal operations. Civilian volunteers went back to their jobs and families. A core group of detectives continued working the case, but with no new evidence and no leads, there was only so much they could do. The missing posters that had covered every telephone pole and store window in West Oakland started to fade. Rain washed away the ink. Wind tore the paper. New posters went up for other things. Upcoming elections, community events, lost pets, covering the old ones until Luis's face disappeared from the streets entirely. But his absence remained. A wound in the heart of the community that refused to heal. For the Albino family, life had to continue somehow. There were 5 other children to feed and care for, bills to pay, work to be done, but nothing felt normal. Nothing felt right. They existed in a strange limbo between grief and hope, unable to move forward because they didn't know if they should be mourning or waiting. And Antonia? She made a decision in those early weeks that would define the rest of her life. She would never stop looking, never stop hoping, never accept that her son was gone. Every single morning, she would wake up, get dressed, and walk to the Oakland Police Department. And she would ask the same question she'd been asking since the day Luis vanished. Noticias de mi hijo? Any news of my son? And every single morning, the answer would be the same. Lo siento, señora. No. We're sorry, ma'am. Nothing. But Antonia would come back the next day. And the day after that. And the day after that. For decades. For the rest of her life. Because a mother knows. Somewhere deep in her bones, in a place beyond logic or reason, she knew her son was alive. She could feel it. And as long as she could feel it, she would keep searching. Even if it took 50 years. Even if it took her entire life. Even if she died without ever knowing the truth. She would never stop believing Luis would come home. And here's the thing that makes this story so incredible, so impossible, so absolutely remarkable. She was right. Let me tell you what 54 years of hope looks like. It looks like a woman in her 30s who walks to the police station every single morning before sunrise, carrying a photograph of a 6-year-old boy, asking the same question in broken English. Mi hijo? My son. It looks like that same woman at 40, still walking to the police station every single week because daily visits are no longer sustainable, but giving up entirely is impossible. It looks like that woman at 50, at 60, at 70, at 80, still coming, still asking, still carrying that laminated newspaper clipping from 1951 that's been folded and unfolded so many times the creases have worn through. It looks like new police officers learning about the mother who never stops searching as part of their orientation, because she's been a fixture at the Oakland PD longer than most of them have been alive. It looks like faith that defies logic, hope that defies reason, love that refuses to accept the finality of loss. That's what Antonia Albino's life became after February 21st, 1951. A singular focus, a mission that consumed every day, every hour, every breath. Find Luis. Bring him home. In those first few months, Antonia went to the police station every single day without fail. She would arrive when they opened and stand in the lobby, waiting patiently for someone to acknowledge her. Most days, a Spanish-speaking officer or a kind neighbor who'd come with her would translate. Some days, her broken English and desperate hand gestures were enough. Any news? She would ask. Sometimes it came out as noticias, sometimes as my son, Sometimes she just held up the photograph, and the question was implicit in her eyes. And every day, the answer was the same. No, Mrs. Albino. We're sorry. No news today. She would nod. Sometimes cry silently, tears sliding down her cheeks while she stood there in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the police station. Sometimes she'd turn and leave without a word, shoulders slumped with fresh disappointment. But she always came back the next day. The desk sergeants came to know her by sight. Mrs. Albino, they'd say gently, often before she even reached the counter. Their voices were kind but exhausted. They wanted to help her, wanted to give her the answer she desperately needed. But they didn't have it, didn't have anything. After about a year, the daily visits became weekly. Not because Antonia had given up. She would never give up, but because life demanded her attention elsewhere. She had 5 other children. A husband working himself to an early grave trying to provide for a family that felt incomplete. Bills that didn't stop coming just because your heart was broken. But she never missed a week. Every Wednesday, like clockwork, regardless of weather or health or what else was happening in her life, Antonia would walk into the Oakland Police Department and ask her question. Noticias de mi hijo? Lo siento, señora. No. The officers watched her age in real time. Watched the dark hair turn gray, then white. Watched the upright posture become stooped. Watched the quick steps slow to a shuffle. But they never watched her give up. At home, one wall of the living room gradually transformed into a shrine to Luis. Not intentionally at first. Just his school photograph hung in a frame. Then the newspaper clipping from 1951 mounted below it. Then other photographs of Luis as a baby, as a toddler, the few precious images they had from Puerto Rico before they immigrated. On his birthday, every year, Antonia would drape a palm frond over the photograph, a tradition from her childhood in Puerto Rico, a way of honoring those who were absent. She'd light candles, sing Feliz Cumpleaños to an empty chair, make a cake that Luis wasn't there to eat. Her other children found these birthday celebrations almost unbearable to witness. Their mother, singing to a ghost. Their father, trying to smile through grief that had carved permanent lines into his face. The overwhelming presence of absence, so thick in the air you could choke on it. Roger was the one who suffered most. As he grew from a traumatized 10-year-old into an increasingly withdrawn teenager, the guilt ate at him like acid. It didn't matter how many times his parents told him it wasn't his fault. Didn't matter how many times they said he'd done exactly what any child would do. The guilt remained, calcifying into something permanent and poisonous. He became hypervigilant about his younger siblings' safety. If one of them was 5 minutes late coming home from school, Roger would be out the door, searching the streets in a panic. If they played at the park, Roger watched them like a hawk, positioning himself between them and any adult who came too close. His parents worried about him. Neighbors whispered about that poor boy who lost his brother. Teachers noticed he'd stopped smiling, stopped participating, started staring out windows like he was searching for something he'd never find. The nightmares were the worst. Almost every night, Roger dreamed about that afternoon. He was back in the park. The woman was there. Luis was walking away, and Roger would try to run after them, try to grab Luis's hand, try to scream for help. But his legs wouldn't move. His voice wouldn't work. He was frozen, paralyzed, helpless. And Luis would disappear around that corner again and again and again. He'd wake up, gasping, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, the guilt crushing his chest so heavily he could barely breathe. Years passed. Luis would have turned 7, then 10, then 12. Each birthday marked with Antonia's quiet ceremony. Each passing year making it less likely he'd ever be found. In 1966, 15 years after Luis disappeared, something unexpected happened. A flicker of hope sparked to life for the first time in over a decade. Luis would have been 21 that year. Draft age. Vietnam War conscription age. If Luis was alive somewhere, if he'd been raised under a different name, he would still have to register for the draft. His date of birth would be on file. His social security number. Some record, somewhere, that might reveal where he was. Antonia seized on this possibility with desperate energy. She contacted military recruitment offices, wrote letters to the Selective Service, begged officials to search their records for any young man with Luis's birth date who might be the right person. She even convinced Roger and one of her daughters to help her travel back to Puerto Rico. Maybe, she thought, the kidnapper had taken Luis there. Back to the island. Back to their homeland. Maybe he was there, living with some family who'd claimed him as their own. They spent weeks in Puerto Rico, showing Luis's photograph to everyone they encountered. Relatives, neighbors, strangers on the street, store owners, teachers, police. Have you seen this boy? He would be 21 now. He was taken from us in California. Please, have you seen him? Nobody had. Nobody remembered a child appearing in 1951 who didn't belong. Nobody had heard rumors or stories about a stolen boy from the mainland. Every door they knocked on led to another dead end. The trip back to Oakland was devastating. Antonia had been so certain this was the answer. So sure they'd find some trace of him in Puerto Rico. But there was nothing. Just the same emptiness they'd been living with for 15 years. Still, she didn't give up. The weekly visits to the police station continued. The birthday celebrations continued. The shrine on the wall continued to grow as other relatives contributed photographs and mementos, turning it into a memorial to a life suspended in time. By the 1970s and 80s, the weekly visits became monthly. Antonia was aging, her health declining, and the walk to the police station was getting harder. But she never stopped going entirely. Once a month, every month, year after year after year. New officers joined the Oakland PD and heard about the mother who never stopped searching. Some found it inspiring, a testament to a mother's love. Some found it heartbreaking, a woman who couldn't accept reality. Some found it morbidly fascinating, this living monument to obsession and grief. But all of them treated her with respect. They never dismissed her, never told her to let it go, to accept that Luis was gone. They just gave her the same answer every time. No news, Mrs. Albino. We're sorry. The case file on Luis Armando Albino had long since been moved to the cold case archives. Detectives pulled it out occasionally when a similar case came through, looking for patterns or connections. But there was nothing to find. No physical evidence. No witnesses beyond Roger. No leads that hadn't been exhausted decades earlier. Luis Albino had simply vanished. And as far as anyone could tell, the mystery would never be solved. At home, Antonia created a daily ritual. Every evening before bed, she would stand in front of the shrine and speak to Luis's photograph. In Spanish, in a voice soft and private, she'd tell him about her day, about his siblings and their children, about the neighborhood, about anything and everything, the way a mother talks to a child who's listening. Te amo, mijo, she'd say at the end. I love you, my son. Sé que volverás a casa. I know you'll come home. Her other children would hear her from down the hall and exchange sad glances. Their mother, talking to a ghost, to a memory, to hope that had long since become delusion in everyone's eyes but hers. Except it wasn't delusion. That's the thing. The impossible thing. The miraculous thing. Because across the country, 740 miles away on the East Coast, a man in his 60s was living his life completely unaware that every single day for the past 50 years, a woman he couldn't remember had been praying for him, searching for him, believing against all logic and reason that he was alive. And he was alive, very much alive, living under a different name, with a different family, with absolutely no idea that somewhere in California, his real mother was dying without ever knowing he'd survived. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Antonia was in her 80s. Her memory was starting to slip. She'd forget what day it was, forget where she'd put her glasses, forget conversations from an hour earlier. But she never forgot Luis. Even as dementia began to cloud her mind, erasing recent memories while leaving old ones crystal clear, she never forgot her missing son. She'd ask about him at odd times. ¿Dónde está Luis? Where's Luis? As if he'd just stepped out to the store and should be back any minute. As if 50 years hadn't passed. As if time had folded in on itself and 1951 was happening right now. Her children would exchange heartbroken looks. He's not here, Mama, they'd say gently. We don't know where he is. She'd look confused for a moment, then nod slowly. An hour later, she'd ask again, ¿Dónde está Luis? In 2005, at the age of 92, Antonia Albino died in her sleep. She'd outlived her husband by a decade, seen her other 5 children grow up, have families, give her dozens of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She'd lived to see the new millennium, lived through wars and recessions and cultural revolutions, lived a long, full life by any measure. But she died not knowing what happened to her youngest son, died still searching, still waiting, still believing he would come home. At her funeral, the family placed a framed photograph of 6-year-old Luis atop her casket. It felt right. Appropriate. Antonia had carried him with her every day for 54 years. He should accompany her on this final journey too. Roger, now 71 years old, stood at his mother's grave and wept. For her. For Luis. For the 6 decades of grief that had defined their family. He was an old man himself now, with grandchildren and health problems and all the ordinary struggles of aging. But he'd never forgotten that afternoon in the park. Never stopped feeling responsible. And now his mother was gone, having died without the answer she'd spent her entire life searching for. It seemed like the end of the story. The final, tragic chapter. The case of Luis Albino would remain forever cold, forever unsolved. A mystery that would die with the generation that remembered it. Roger assumed he'd go to his own grave without ever knowing what happened to his little brother. That Luis's fate would remain one of life's unanswerable questions. That some mysteries were simply never meant to be solved. But Roger was wrong. Because 19 years after Antonia's death, 63 years after she started her daily pilgrimage to the police station, 73 years after a 6-year-old boy vanished from an Oakland park, a woman named Alida Alquin was about to do something that would change everything. She was going to spit in a tube. And that simple act, that mundane, unremarkable gesture, would crack open a mystery that had remained sealed for nearly 3/4 of a century. Here's the part of the story that still gives me chills every time I think about it. While Antonia was making her daily trips to the police station, while Roger was drowning in guilt, while the Oakland Police Department was filing away the cold case that would haunt them for decades, Luis Armando Albino was alive. Not just alive. Living. Breathing. Growing up. Going to school. Learning to ride a bike. Playing with friends. Celebrating birthdays. Becoming a teenager. Falling in love. Joining the military. Fighting in a war. Building a career. Getting married. Having children. Becoming a grandfather. All of it. A full, complete life. Every milestone. Every memory. Every moment. Except none of it was supposed to happen. None of it was meant to be his life. Let me take you back to that moment when the woman in the bandana led Luis away from the park, around that corner, out of Roger's sight. What happened next is partially speculation, partially information that came to light after Luis was found, and partially the kind of detective work that fills in the blanks. The woman took Luis to the airport, Oakland Municipal Airport, now known as Oakland International. And here's where the story gets even more disturbing. In 1951, air travel was still relatively uncommon, especially for working-class people. It was expensive, formal. You dressed up to fly. You showed some basic identification. But children? Children could board planes with adults, no questions asked, as long as the adult claimed to be a parent or guardian. There were no detailed passenger manifests, no security screenings, no TSA, no system for checking whether a child traveling with an adult was actually related to that adult. So imagine this scene. A woman walks up to an airline counter with a small boy. She's well-dressed, calm, confident. The boy is quiet, maybe scared, maybe confused, maybe she'd given him something to make him drowsy. She purchases 2 tickets to somewhere on the East Coast. New York? Pennsylvania? Maryland? The exact destination has never been publicly revealed, but we know it was far. 3,000 miles far. The ticket agent smiles at Luis. Is this your son? Yes. The woman says without hesitation. We're going to visit family. How old is he? 6. He looks nervous. First time flying. Yes. The woman says, putting her hand on Luis's shoulder in a gesture that looks protective but is actually possessive. He's a little scared of the plane, but he'll be fine once we're in the air. The ticket agent stamps their boarding passes and waves them through. Nobody questions it. Why would they? It's just a mother traveling with her young son. Happens 100 times a day at airports across America. Luis would have been terrified. Remember, he'd probably never been on a plane before. His family couldn't afford that kind of luxury. So when the woman led him across the tarmac to a propeller aircraft, when the engines roared to life, when the plane lifted off the ground and Oakland fell away beneath them, it must have felt like being kidnapped by a monster and taken to another planet. Did he cry for his mother? Did he ask where they were going? Did he beg to go home? We'll never know. Luis has no memory of this journey. The trauma, combined with his young age, combined with what was about to happen to him, erased it completely from his mind. The flight took hours. Commercial aviation in 1951 was slow, with multiple stops for refueling. Luis would have spent that entire journey in a state of confusion and fear, sitting next to a woman he didn't know, flying toward a destination he couldn't understand, unable to comprehend what was happening to him. And then they landed, somewhere on the East Coast, somewhere cold and unfamiliar and 3,000 miles from everything Luis had ever known. A car was waiting, or maybe they took a taxi, or a bus. However they traveled, Luis was taken from the airport to a house. And at that house, a couple was waiting. This is where the story gets murky, where facts give way to educated guesses. But here's what we can piece together. The couple waiting at that house were childless. They wanted a baby desperately, but couldn't have one, or couldn't adopt through legal channels for some reason. Maybe they were too old. Maybe their background check revealed something disqualifying. Maybe they simply didn't want to wait years on an adoption list. So they'd gone looking for an alternative. A black market adoption. A criminal enterprise that existed in the shadows of 1950s America, where desperate couples could pay criminals to acquire children for them. The woman in the bandana wasn't random. She was probably part of a network. A professional. Someone who'd done this before, or who'd been hired specifically for this job. She'd been paid, possibly paid handsomely, to acquire a young child. Not an infant, which would be too difficult to care for during transport. Not an older child, who might remember too much or be too difficult to control. But a young child, somewhere between 5 and 7 years old. Old enough to be relatively self-sufficient. Young enough to adapt. So she'd gone to Oakland. Maybe she'd been watching that park for days, looking for the right target. Maybe she'd specifically targeted Puerto Rican families, knowing that the language barrier would make it harder for them to report the crime effectively. Or maybe she'd just gotten lucky, spotting two boys playing alone, seeing an opportunity, taking it. Either way, she'd acquired the product, transported it across the country, and now she was delivering it to the paying customers. The exchange probably happened quickly. Money changed hands. Papers were signed, forged papers, fake birth certificates, documents that would give this couple legal guardianship of a child who didn't legally belong to them. And then the woman in the bandana left. Her job was done. She probably never thought about Luis Albino again. But the couple? They had a son now. Or so they believed. Or so they told themselves. Whether they knew he'd been kidnapped, or whether they'd been lied to by the broker about his origins, we'll never know. They're dead now. Dead for years. The truth died with them. What we do know is this. They gave Luis a new name. Not Luis. Not Albino. Something completely different. A good American name. Something that would help him blend in. Something that would erase any connection to the little boy who disappeared from an Oakland park. And they raised him as their son. Think about that for a moment. Think about what that means. Luis, at age 6, was told, or perhaps just allowed to believe, that these strangers were his parents. That this unfamiliar house was his home. That this cold East Coast city was where he'd always lived. At first, he must have resisted. Must have asked for his real mother. His real family. Must have cried and demanded to go home. 6-year-olds don't just forget their entire lives overnight. But children are adaptable in ways that adults can never be. The human brain, especially a young human brain, will do whatever it takes to survive. And if survival means accepting a new reality, it will accept it. It will adapt. It will rewrite itself. If Luis spoke Spanish at home and suddenly found himself in an English-speaking household, he would have lost his Spanish within months. The neuroplasticity of a 6-year-old brain is extraordinary. Total language immersion will replace a native language faster than you'd believe possible. If he had memories of Puerto Rico, of his real mother's face, of Roger's protective presence, those memories would have started to blur, to fade, to feel like dreams rather than real events. Especially if the adoptive parents told him those memories weren't real, that he'd always been with them, that he was imagining things. Gaslighting. That's what we'd call it today. But in 1951, there wasn't a word for it. There was just a little boy whose grip on reality was being systematically dismantled and reconstructed. By the time Luis was 7, he probably believed the lie. Or at least, he'd stopped fighting it. He answered to his new name. He called these strangers mom and dad. He went to school and made friends and acted like a normal kid because the alternative, holding on to a past that everyone told him wasn't real, was too painful, too confusing, too impossible. By the time he was 8, 9, 10 years old, the memories of his first 6 years had faded to vague impressions. A woman's face that he couldn't quite remember. A language he used to speak but couldn't recall. A sense of something missing, something lost, but no concrete understanding of what it was. This is what trauma does to a child's brain. It protects you by erasing the unendurable. And Luis's brain, trying desperately to protect him, erased Antonia, erased Roger, erased Oakland, erased Puerto Rico, erased everything that hurt too much to remember. So Luis grew up on the East Coast as someone else. He went to school, learned to read and write in English, played Little League baseball or street hockey or whatever kids did in his neighborhood. He hit puberty, became a teenager, started noticing girls, went to high school, a completely normal childhood, completely normal adolescence, except built on a foundation of lies so profound that when he eventually learned the truth, it would shatter everything he thought he knew about himself. And then came Vietnam. The 1960s arrived. The Vietnam War escalated. Young men across America were being drafted or enlisting. And Luis, or rather, the person Luis had become, the identity he'd been given, joined the United States Marine Corps. Here's where the irony becomes almost unbearable. Remember back in 1966 when Antonia was checking military draft records, hoping to find some trace of Luis? When the family was scanning lists of 21-year-olds registered with the Selective Service, hoping his name would appear somewhere. He was there, right there, in the military, but not under the name Luis Armando Albino, under whatever name his adoptive parents had given him, under an identity that didn't exist before 1951, under a birthday that might not even have been his real birthday. So when the Albino family searched for Luis in military records, they found nothing, because the Luis they were looking for didn't exist anymore. He'd been erased, replaced, transformed into someone else entirely. And that someone else was a Marine, a United States Marine headed to Vietnam. Luis served 2 tours of duty. 2 tours. That means he went to Vietnam, came home, and then voluntarily went back. That speaks to a certain kind of person. Brave, dedicated, someone who felt a sense of duty and honor, someone who ran toward danger instead of away from it. Imagine that. While his biological family was back in California searching for him, praying for him, mourning him, Luis was in the jungles of Southeast Asia. He was fighting, watching friends die, firing weapons, getting shot at, living through the kind of trauma that would scar an entire generation of American men. Did he ever have moments of déjà vu? Moments where something felt familiar in a way he couldn't explain? Did he ever hear Spanish spoken and feel a strange pull toward it? Did he ever dream about a woman whose face he couldn't quite remember but whose absence felt like a wound? We'll never know. Luis doesn't remember those feelings. Doesn't remember any sense that his life wasn't what it seemed. To him, he was just a regular American kid who grew up and joined the Marines and served his country. Nothing mysterious about it. He came home from Vietnam like millions of other veterans did. Changed. Traumatized. Carrying psychological wounds that wouldn't be diagnosed or treated properly for decades because PTSD wasn't even a recognized diagnosis until 1980. But he survived. He'd survived being kidnapped, survived having his identity stolen, and now he'd survived Vietnam. This man was a survivor in every sense of the word. After the war, Luis built a life. He became a firefighter. And I have to pause here because there's something almost cosmically poetic about that career choice. A firefighter. Someone who runs into burning buildings to save people. Someone whose entire job is rescuing people from danger. Someone who spends their career pulling people out of situations where they're trapped and can't save themselves. Luis had needed someone to rescue him when he was 6 years old. Someone to pull him away from that woman, to take him back to his real family, to save him from the life that was about to be stolen from him. But no one had come. No one had saved him. So he became the rescuer. The person who saves others. The person who runs toward danger instead of away from it. The person who makes sure that people in distress don't stay trapped. I don't know if Luis ever thought about the symbolism of that. Probably not. Probably it was just a good job with good benefits and a sense of purpose. But from the outside, looking at his story, it's impossible not to see the connection. Luis married, had children, watched those children grow up and have children of their own. He became a grandfather. He attended school plays and birthday parties and graduations. He barbecued on summer weekends. He watched football games. He complained about the weather and politics and all the ordinary things that ordinary people complain about. He had a good life. By all accounts, a really good life. His adoptive parents, whatever their role in the initial crime, seemed to have raised him well. He grew up to be kind, brave, honorable, the kind of man you'd be proud to know, the kind of father and grandfather every child deserves. And he had absolutely no idea that any of it was based on a lie. No idea that 3,000 miles away, an elderly woman had visited a police station thousands of times asking about him. No idea that his brother, his real brother, had carried guilt about losing him for 73 years. No idea that he had an entire family in California who told stories about him, who kept his photograph on a wall, who marked his birthday every year with prayers and tears and wishes. No idea that his real name was Luis Armando Albino. By 2020, he was 75 years old, retired from the fire department after decades of service, probably dealing with the normal health issues that come with age, probably enjoying a quiet life, spending time with grandchildren, maybe tending a garden, maybe playing cards with other retired firefighters who'd become his closest friends over the years. A peaceful life, an earned peace. After surviving kidnapping, even though he didn't know it, after surviving Vietnam, after decades of running into burning buildings, he'd earned the right to a quiet retirement. He had no reason to suspect that his entire identity was about to be called into question. No reason to think that a knock on the door or a phone call would shatter everything he thought he knew about himself. He was just an old man living a normal life, going to the grocery store, watching the news, complaining about his aching joints. Ordinary, unremarkable content. But across the country, something extraordinary was about to happen. Something that would reach across 73 years and 3,000 miles and pull him back into a life he didn't remember living. Because a woman he'd never met was about to spit in a tube. And that saliva, that collection of cells containing his genetic code, or rather, the genetic code of his family, was about to solve a mystery that everyone had assumed was unsolvable. The ghost was about to come home, whether he wanted to or not. 2020, the year the world stopped. A global pandemic shut down entire countries. People were isolated in their homes, watching the death toll climb on the news, trying to figure out how to live in a reality that suddenly felt dystopian and surreal. And in that isolation, people turned to hobbies. Baking bread, learning languages, organizing closets, and for millions of people, exploring their ancestry through DNA testing. The commercials made it look fun. Spit in a tube, mail it back, wait 6 weeks, and discover where your ancestors came from. Find out if you're part Viking or part Asian or part something completely unexpected. Connect with distant cousins you never knew existed. Alida Alquin was 63 years old, stuck at home during lockdown, and curious. She'd heard her family's stories her whole life. Puerto Rican roots, Spanish heritage, maybe some indigenous American ancestry mixed in there somewhere. It would be interesting to see what the DNA test said. Maybe she'd find some distant relatives. Maybe there'd be a fun surprise in the ethnic breakdown. I did it just for fun, she'd later tell reporters. Just something to do during quarantine. I wasn't expecting to find anything important. She ordered a kit from one of the popular DNA testing companies, probably Ancestry DNA or 23andMe, though the exact company hasn't been publicly confirmed. The kit arrived in a small box. A plastic tube. Simple instructions. Spit in the tube until the saliva reaches the line. Seal it. Put it in the prepaid envelope. Drop it in the mail. Done. Alida did exactly that and promptly forgot about it. The pandemic was raging. The world felt like it was ending. A DNA test was the least of her concerns. 6 weeks later, an email. Your DNA results are ready. Alida logged into the website, expecting to see a pie chart. Maybe she'd be 80% European, 15% Indigenous American, 5% African. That would be cool. That would match what she knew about her family history. But the first thing that caught her eye wasn't the ethnic breakdown. It was the DNA matches. See, these DNA testing companies don't just tell you your ethnic percentages. They also compare your DNA to everyone else in their database and show you people who share genetic markers with you. Usually, these matches are distant cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who share a great-great-great-grandparent with you and not much else. The shared DNA percentages are usually tiny. 3%, 5%. Numbers that indicate a distant relationship. Interesting, but not particularly meaningful. But at the top of Alida's match list was something that made her breath catch in her throat. 22% shared DNA. 22%. With a man estimated to be in his mid-70s. Let me explain why that number is so significant. In genetic genealogy, percentages matter. A lot. 50% shared DNA, parent or full sibling. 25% shared DNA, grandparent, grandchild, aunt, uncle, half-sibling. 12.5% shared DNA, first cousin. 6% shared DNA, first cousin once removed. 3% shared DNA, second cousin. 22% falls right in that second category. This wasn't a distant cousin. This was a close relative. Someone who shared significant genetic material with her. An uncle. A half-sibling. Someone directly related in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Alida stared at the screen. She knew her uncles. She knew her aunts. She had a detailed family tree in her head because her grandmother, Antonia, gone for 15 years now, had told the stories over and over. Every cousin, every relation, every branch of the family tree. But this man, she'd never heard of him. The username on his profile didn't match anyone she knew. The age range suggested someone from her parents' generation, but he wasn't anyone she recognized. Her mind started racing through possibilities. An illegitimate child? A half-uncle from an affair? Some secret branch of the family that no one talked about? But 22% was too high for that. That's direct line family. That's someone who should be impossible to miss. And then, slowly, impossibly, a thought crept into her mind. A thought so absurd that she almost dismissed it immediately. Could this be Uncle Luis? No, that was crazy. Luis had disappeared in 1951. This was 2020. 69 years. The odds of him being alive at 75 years old were already slim. The odds of him having taken a DNA test that ended up in the same database as hers. Astronomical. Impossible. But 22%. An unknown man in his 70s. Unknown to the family, but directly related. What else could explain it? Alida's hands were shaking as she clicked on the match to see if there was any additional information. No family tree attached. No photographs. Just a username and that percentage. 22%. Undeniable. Irrefutable. She composed a message through the website's private messaging system. Trying to sound casual, not wanting to come across as insane. Hi. I see we have a significant DNA match. I'm trying to learn more about my family tree and was hoping you might be able to help. Do you know if you have any relatives from Puerto Rico? Or if anyone in your family was adopted? I'd love to connect and learn more about our family connection. Please get in touch if you see this message. Thank you. She hit send and waited. Days passed. No response. She checked the website obsessively. Had he read the message? Was he ignoring her? Did he not check his account anymore? Weeks passed. Nothing. A month. 2 months. The pandemic continued. The world remained locked down. And Alida's message sat there, unanswered, a digital bottle thrown into an ocean with no idea if anyone would ever find it. Life went on. Eventually, lockdown restrictions eased. The world started opening up again. Vaccines were developed. The pandemic, while still present, became more manageable. Alida went back to work, back to normal life, back to the routines that had been disrupted. But that 22% match nagged at her. Quietly. Persistently. A puzzle piece that didn't fit anywhere but clearly belonged to the picture somehow. For years past. 2021. 2022. 2023. 2024. And then, in early 2024, something shifted. Maybe Alida saw a documentary about genetic genealogy solving cold cases. Maybe she read an article about a family reunion facilitated by DNA. Maybe she just woke up one morning and couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to try again. Or maybe it was because she'd been thinking about her grandmother, Antonia, who died in 2005 without ever knowing what happened to Luis, who'd spent 54 years searching, hoping, believing against all evidence that her son was alive. What if she'd been right? What if Luis was alive? What if that 22% match was him? Alida decided she couldn't let it go. Not without trying harder. Not without exhausting every possibility. She called her daughters. Both of them were adults now, in their 30s, good with computers and internet research. She told them about the DNA match, about the unanswered message, about the possibility, however remote, that this might be their great-uncle Luis. Her daughters were skeptical at first. Mom, that's impossible. He's been missing for 70 years. He's probably dead. Probably, Alida agreed. But what if he's not? What if Abuela was right this whole time? That got them, because they'd all grown up hearing about Abuela's unshakable faith, her daily trips to the police station, her refusal to believe Luis was dead, the family legend of the mother who never gave up. What if that legend was about to be vindicated? The three of them, Alida and her two daughters, sat down at a computer and started digging. They looked at the DNA match again, studying every scrap of information available. They searched for the username, trying to find any public information connected to it. And slowly, painstakingly, they started finding threads. A possible name connected to the username. A location, somewhere on the East Coast, which matched what investigators had theorized back in 1951 about Luis being transported out of California. A profession mentioned in an old public record, firefighter. The more they dug, the more pieces fell into place, or seemed to fall into place. It was all circumstantial, all speculation, but it was adding up to something that felt more and more likely with each new piece of information. But they needed proof, something concrete, something that would convince not just them, but authorities. Because if this really was Luis, if he really had been kidnapped and was living under a false identity, that was a crime, a federal crime, and the police would need evidence before they could act. Alida had a brilliant idea. We need to go to the library. The library? The newspaper archives. From 1951. If we can find the original articles about Luis's disappearance, if we can find the photograph they published, we can compare it to pictures of this man. So they went to the Oakland Public Library, down to the basement where old newspapers were preserved on microfilm. Alida threaded a reel onto the machine, wound back through time to February 1951, and started scrolling. And there it was. The Oakland Tribune. Missing boy search continues. Child abducted from local park. Family desperate for answers. And the photograph. Two brothers, Roger and Luis. Taken either right before or right after the abduction. Two faces frozen in time. Roger, 10 years old, with an arm around his little brother. Luis, 6 years old, grinning at the camera with that gap-toothed smile, completely unaware that his picture would become the public face of a mystery that would last 73 years. Alida stared at that photograph for a long time. She'd seen it before. It had been on Antonia's wall her entire childhood. But now it felt different. Now it felt like evidence. She printed copies of the microfilm, made notes about the articles, documented everything. And then she went back to the modern photographs she'd managed to find of the mystery man from the DNA match. She laid them side by side. The 6-year-old Luis from 1951. The 75-year-old man from 2024. Can you see someone's 6-year-old face in their 75-year-old face? Can you recognize a child in an elderly person after nearly 7 decades? Usually no. Usually, that much time erases everything recognizable. But sometimes, there are features that persist. The shape of the eyes, the line of the nose, the way the mouth curves, the things that are determined by bone structure rather than by age. Alida saw it. Around the eyes especially. The same shape, the same placement. And the nose, that same slight curve. And when she looked at her own mother, Luis's sister, she saw echoes of that face there too. The albino family resemblance. This had to be him. It had to be. She gathered everything she had. The DNA results showing the 22% match. The newspaper clippings from 1951. The photographs, old and new. Her notes from the internet research. Everything. And on March 18, 2024, exactly 73 years and 26 days after Luis Albino disappeared from Brush Street Park, Alida Alquin walked into the Oakland Police Department and said something that no one there expected to hear. I think I found my uncle. The one who was kidnapped in 1951. I think he's alive. The desk sergeant looked at her like she was insane, which was understandable. People walk into police stations all the time claiming to have solved decades-old mysteries. 99.9% of the time, they're conspiracy theorists or attention seekers or people who've watched too many true crime documentaries. But Alida wasn't some random person making wild claims. She was family. She had documentation. And most importantly, she had DNA evidence. Please, she said, spreading her papers across the counter. Just look at what I have. I know it sounds impossible, but please, just look. And to the Oakland Police Department's eternal credit, they did look. They listened. They reviewed her evidence. They pulled the old case file on Luis Armando Albino, a file that hadn't been opened in years, maybe decades. and they realized this woman might actually be onto something. This wasn't a crackpot theory. This was legitimate investigative work backed by genetic science. Within 48 hours, the case was reopened. The FBI was contacted. The California Department of Justice was brought in. Because if Alida was right, if Luis really was alive, living under a false identity on the East Coast, this was huge. This was one of the oldest missing child cases in American history, potentially being solved with a living victim. But they had to confirm it, had to prove it beyond any doubt. They had to find the man Alida had identified. They had to convince him to provide a DNA sample. And then they had to wait for the results that would either prove Alida right or crush her hope entirely. The investigation moved quickly but carefully. FBI agents located the man based on the information Alida had provided. They approached him delicately, knowing this conversation could destroy someone's entire sense of self. How do you tell someone that they might not be who they think they are? That everything they know about their identity might be a lie? That they might have been kidnapped as a child and given a false identity? The agents knocked on his door, showed their badges, asked if they could come in and talk. The man, let's keep calling him Luis, even though he didn't know that was his name yet, was confused, suspicious. What did the FBI want with a retired firefighter? He hadn't done anything wrong. He'd paid his taxes, lived a law-abiding life. The agents sat him down and explained, as gently as possible, that they had reason to believe he might be connected to a very old missing person case. That in 1951, a 6-year-old boy named Luis Armando Albino had been abducted from Oakland, California. That they had DNA evidence suggesting he might be that boy. Luis's first reaction, according to later accounts, was to laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. Him? A kidnapped child? He'd lived his whole life right here. He knew who his parents were. He knew his birthday, his family history, everything. This had to be a mistake. The FBI had the wrong guy. But the agents showed him the photograph from 1951. 2 brothers. The smaller one, they explained, was Luis Albino, the boy who disappeared. Luis stared at the photograph, at the 6-year-old child grinning at the camera, and something shifted in his expression. Something that might have been recognition, or might have been confusion, or might have been the first crack in a wall that had been built 73 years ago. Would you be willing to provide a DNA sample? The agents asked. Just to rule this out definitively. If you're not Luis Albino, the test will prove it. But if there's any chance. Luis agreed. What choice did he have? If this was all a mistake, the DNA test would prove it. And if it wasn't a mistake, well, he needed to know the truth, didn't he? A simple cheek swab. That's all it took. The agents had already obtained DNA samples from Luis's sister, Alida's mother, who was still alive and living in California. They just needed Luis's DNA to compare. The sample was sent to a lab. And then came the hardest part, waiting. Waiting for results that would either preserve Luis's reality or shatter it completely. On June 20th, 2024, the results came back. Conclusive, definitive, no room for doubt or interpretation. The man the FBI had tested was, genetically speaking, the biological son of Antonia Albino and the brother of Roger Albino and his siblings. He was, without question, the 6-year-old boy who had disappeared from an Oakland park on February 21, 1951. He was Luis Armando Albino, the man who'd spent 73 years living as someone else, who'd built an entire life under a false identity, who'd had absolutely no idea he'd been stolen from his real family as a child, was about to have his entire world turned upside down. And back in California, when Alida got the phone call confirming what she'd suspected, what she'd hoped, she and her mother held each other and cried like the world was ending and beginning at the same time. Because Antonia had been right. She'd been right all along. Luis was alive. They'd found him. After 73 years, the ghost was coming home. June 24, 2024. 4 days after the DNA confirmation. Oakland International Airport, Terminal 1. The scene looked like something out of a movie, except it was real, and everyone there knew they were living through something impossible. Dozens of people gathered at the arrival's gate. 3 generations of the Albino family. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. People ranging in age from 70 to 7. Some had clear memories of the family stories about Uncle Luis. Others had only heard whispers. But they were all there, waiting to meet a ghost made flesh. Alida stood at the front of the crowd, her mother beside her. Both women were trembling. Alida from excitement and nervousness. Her mother, Luis's sister, from something deeper. She'd been born after Luis disappeared. She'd never met her youngest brother. He was a photograph to her, a story, a legend. And now he was about to walk through that gate and become real. The flight from the East Coast landed on time. People began trickling out of the gate. Business travelers pulling rolling suitcases. Families returning from vacations. The usual crowd. And then he appeared. An elderly man, 75 years old, with gray hair and a face marked by 7 decades of living. He was tall, or had been, before age stooped his shoulders slightly. He wore simple clothes, jeans, a button-up shirt, comfortable shoes. He walked with the slight stiffness of someone whose joints ached. He looked, in every way, like an ordinary elderly man. Except he wasn't ordinary. He was Luis Armando Albino, the boy who'd vanished. The missing piece of a family puzzle. The answer to a 73-year-old question. The family recognized him immediately. Not because he looked like the 6-year-old in the photograph. How could he? But because Alida had shown everyone pictures. Modern pictures. Pictures of this man as he was now. So they knew his face. Knew they were looking at the right person. Luis scanned the crowd, looking lost and overwhelmed. His own children and grandchildren were with him. They'd insisted on coming, wanting to support him through this surreal experience. They looked as bewildered as he did. Yesterday, they'd been one family. Today, they were being absorbed into another family they'd never known existed. Alida moved first. She walked toward Luis, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. This was the man she'd found, the case she'd cracked, the miracle she'd made happen. But standing in front of him, looking up at this stranger who was somehow her uncle, she didn't know what to say. Luis looked down at her. For a moment, they just stared at each other. A woman in her 60s and a man in his 70s, connected by DNA and family history, but separated by a lifetime of different experiences. And then Luis opened his arms and pulled her into a hug. A long, tight embrace. The kind where you hold on because letting go feels impossible. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for finding me." Those words, those 5 simple words, they contained everything. Gratitude, relief, recognition that he'd been lost, whether he'd known it or not, and that someone had cared enough to search for him, that he mattered enough to be worth finding. Alida couldn't speak, could only nod against his shoulder and cry. And then the floodgates opened. The rest of the family surged forward, everyone wanting to hug him, to touch him, to confirm he was real. Luis's sister threw her arms around him, sobbing, saying mi hermano, over and over. My brother, my brother. Luis held her, this woman who was both a stranger and his sister, and you could see the confusion and emotion warring on his face. How do you process this? How do you reconcile 73 years of one reality with the sudden introduction of an entirely different reality? Nieces and nephews introduced themselves. I'm Maria's daughter, your niece. I'm Roger's grandson, your great-nephew. Your mother was my grandmother. Everyone trying to explain complicated family relationships, trying to orient Luis in a family tree he'd been absent from for his entire life. They showed him photographs. So many photographs. Pictures of Antonia, so Luis could see the face of the mother he didn't remember. Pictures of the family through the years, birthdays, weddings, graduations, every milestone Luis should have been part of but wasn't. The family history he'd been excluded from. His history, the life that had been stolen from him. Luis looked at each photograph carefully. Some triggered something, not quite a memory, but a feeling. A vague sense of familiarity that he couldn't quite place. Others were completely foreign to him. But he looked at all of them, trying to absorb 73 years of family history in a single, overwhelming afternoon. But the most important reunion was still to come. Roger, the brother who'd been there the day Luis was taken. The brother who'd carried guilt like a physical weight for 73 years. The brother who was now 83 years old and waiting in Stanislaus County, about 2 hours from Oakland. The next day, Alida drove Luis, some of Luis's children and grandchildren, and Luis's sister to Roger's home. The car ride was quiet. Everyone lost in their own thoughts. Luis was probably trying to prepare himself for meeting the brother he couldn't remember, trying to figure out what to say to someone whose life had been defined by losing him. Roger's house was small, neat, in a quiet neighborhood. As they pulled up, they could see him on the front porch. 83 years old. bent by age and illness. But the moment he saw the car, the moment he recognized Luis stepping out, something transformed in his face. For 73 years, Roger had been 10 years old again every time he closed his eyes. 10 years old and standing on that sidewalk, watching his little brother disappear around a corner. 10 years old and making the choice to run for help instead of running after Luis. 10 years old and failing. But now, watching Luis walk toward him, Roger wasn't 10 years old anymore. He was 83, and his brother wasn't 6. He was 75. They were both old men, both survivors, both still here, against all odds. They met in the middle of the front yard. Two elderly men, one bent with age and illness, one straight back from a lifetime of physical work. Brothers, separated as children, reunited as grandfathers. Roger's hand came up, trembling, and touched Luis's face. Like he needed to confirm Luis was real. Solid. Not a ghost or a dream. Luisito, Roger whispered. The childhood nickname. A name he hadn't spoken in 73 years. You're alive. You're really alive. And then they embraced. A long, desperate hug. The kind where neither man wanted to be the first to let go. Roger was sobbing. Deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to be pulling 73 years of guilt and grief out of his body all at once. Luis held him, this stranger who was his brother, and something broke open in his chest. Not a memory, exactly, but a feeling, a sense of connection, a recognition that went deeper than conscious thought. His body knew this man, even if his mind didn't. They sat together on the front porch, arms around each other, and talked for hours. Roger told him everything. About that day at the park. About the woman with the bandana. About running for help. About the guilt he'd carried every single day since. About their mother who never stopped searching. About the family that never forgot him. Luis listened, trying to reconcile these stories with the blank space in his memory where his first 6 years should have been. Trying to understand that these weren't just stories. This was his life. His real life. The one that had been taken from him and replaced with something else. I'm sorry, Roger kept saying, over and over. I'm so sorry I couldn't save you. I'm so sorry. You were 10 years old, Luis told him, his voice gentle. You were a child. You did everything you could. But I should have. No, Luis said firmly. You were brave. You tried to protect me. You ran for help. You did exactly what you should have done. None of this was your fault. Those words, the absolution Roger had needed for 73 years, broke something in him. He wept like he'd never wept before. Great, heaving sobs. The kind that leave you exhausted and empty and somehow lighter. And Luis held him through it. This stranger brother. This man he didn't remember but was connected to by blood and DNA, and a single afternoon in 1951 when their lives diverged into parallel tracks that should never have separated. They talked about their lives. Roger told Luis about their parents, their siblings, the family in Puerto Rico. Luis told Roger about Vietnam, about becoming a firefighter, about his own children and grandchildren. 2 lives, lived in parallel, now intersecting after 7 decades. Did you ever feel like something was missing? Roger asked. Did you ever have any sense that your life wasn't what it seemed? Luis considered this. Sometimes, he admitted. Sometimes I'd have these dreams. Or these feelings. Like I'd forgotten something important. But I never knew what it was. I thought everyone felt that way. They talked about their military service. Both had served, though Roger had been stationed stateside while Luis went to Vietnam. They talked about their careers, their families, their grandchildren, filling in 73 years of blanks as quickly as they could. The sun set. The family went inside for dinner. Luis met Roger's children and grandchildren, adding even more branches to the family tree he was slowly beginning to understand was his. It was overwhelming, exhausting, emotional in ways Luis hadn't been prepared for. But it was also something else. Something he couldn't quite name. A sense of rightness, maybe. Like a puzzle piece finally clicking into place after a lifetime of not quite fitting anywhere. Over the following days and weeks, Luis stayed in California, getting to know his biological family. There were big gatherings where the entire extended clan came to meet him. Traditional Puerto Rican meals, arroz con gandals, pernil, tostines, that brought back vague sense memories Luis couldn't quite identify, but that felt familiar in a way he couldn't explain. His own children and grandchildren, who'd come with him on this journey, were integrating themselves into this new family too. It was surreal for everyone. Two separate family trees being grafted together, trying to create relationships that had no precedent. First cousins meeting for the first time in their 60s. Great-grandchildren discovering they had entire branches of extended family they'd never known existed. But somehow it worked. Because family isn't just about shared history. It's about shared DNA, shared stories, and the willingness to make space for each other in your life and heart. Luis was given the photograph from 1951, the one of him and Roger. He stared at it for a long time, trying to find himself in that 6-year-old child's face, trying to remember that moment, trying to remember anything from before. But there was nothing, just a blank space where those memories should have been. The trauma and the passage of time had erased them too completely. I wish I could remember, he told Alida. I wish I could remember my mother. The woman who never stopped looking for me. She knew, Alida told him. She knew you were alive. She never doubted it. She believed, right up until the day she died, that you would come home. I wish she could have known she was right. I think, Alida said gently. Wherever she is, she knows now. In July 2024, Luis returned to his home on the East Coast. But everything was different now. He had two families, two identities, two sets of children and grandchildren, two completely different life stories. The man who'd raised him, his adoptive father, had died years earlier. But Luis's adoptive family still existed, still loved him, still considered him their father and grandfather. And Luis loved them too, because they'd raised him. They'd been there for every milestone, every achievement, every difficulty. The question everyone wanted to ask, but was too polite to voice was, how did Luis feel about the people who'd raised him? Were they complicit in the kidnapping? Had they known he was stolen? Luis never publicly condemned them, never said they were monsters or that his childhood was terrible, because it wasn't. By all accounts, they'd raised him well, loved him, given him a good life. But the foundation of that life had been built on a crime, on a lie, on the destruction of another family's happiness. And there was no way to reconcile that completely. Luis started therapy, processing trauma he didn't know he had, grief for a mother he didn't remember, confusion about his own identity, questions about who he really was, the person he'd been for 73 years, or the person he should have been. His children and grandchildren were processing their own complicated feelings. Their entire family history had been rewritten overnight. They'd thought they knew where they came from, who their ancestors were, their ethnic heritage, their family stories, and all of it had been partially false. But they rallied around Luis, supported him, accepted the new California family as part of their family too. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't Luis's fault. He was a victim who'd lost his childhood, his identity, his biological family, and 73 years he could never get back. In August 2024, 2 months after the reunion, Roger Albino died peacefully in his sleep. He was 83 years old. His health had been declining for years. But he'd held on just long enough to see his brother one more time. Long enough to know that Luis was safe. Long enough to receive the forgiveness he'd needed for 73 years. At Roger's funeral, Luis stood at the casket and wept for the brother he'd only just found, for the decades they'd lost, for the friendship they would never get to build. But he also felt something else, gratitude. Because Roger had held on, had waited, had lived long enough to give Luis the gift of knowing where he came from. The family buried Roger next to Antonia. Mother and son reunited in death, the way Luis had been reunited with his family in life. On Roger's headstone, the family inscribed a simple message. He never stopped searching, and he found him. And that, more than any eulogy, more than any words spoken at the funeral, captured everything. The 73-year journey, the mother who believed, the brother who felt responsible, the niece who refused to let the mystery die, and the man who came home without ever knowing he'd been lost. The reunion was beautiful, miraculous, the kind of ending that seems too good to be true. But this story doesn't end with a neat bow tied around it. Because there are still questions. Dark questions. Unanswered questions. Questions that may never be answered. Who was the woman in the bandana? What was her name? Where did she come from? Is she still alive? And if not, when did she die? Where is she buried? Did she ever think about the little boy she stole? Did she ever feel guilt? Or was Luis just a job to her, a transaction, something she did for money and then forgot about? These questions haunt the case even now. The Oakland Police Department and FBI have officially reopened the criminal investigation into Luis's kidnapping. Not the missing person case. That's closed now. Luis has been found. But the crime itself. Because someone committed a federal felony in 1951. Someone abducted a child, transported him across state lines, and delivered him to people who raised him under a false identity. That's kidnapping. That's identity theft. That's child trafficking. That's a whole list of crimes that, technically, have no statute of limitations. But practically speaking, finding answers after 73 years is nearly impossible. The woman who took Luis was in her 30s in 1951. If she were alive today, she'd be over 100 years old. The statistical likelihood of that is essentially zero. She's almost certainly dead. Dead for decades, probably. And whatever she knew about who hired her, who paid her, what the full network looked like, she took it to her grave. Luis himself has no memory that can help identify her. He was 6 when it happened. The trauma of being taken, combined with the systematic dismantling of his original identity, combined with 73 years of living as someone else, has erased those memories completely. He doesn't remember the flight across the country, doesn't remember arriving on the East Coast, doesn't remember being handed over to his adoptive parents. The human mind, protecting itself from unbearable trauma, has simply deleted those files, which leaves investigators with very little to work with. Roger's description from 1951, vague and uncertain even then, certainly not improved by 73 years and Roger's death. The Oakland Tribune articles describing her as Spanish-speaking, medium height, medium build, wearing a bandana. And that's it. No name, no photograph, no fingerprints, no DNA evidence, because DNA analysis didn't exist in 1951 and any physical evidence from that day is long gone. The FBI has theories, of course. The most likely scenario is black market adoption. A childless couple on the East Coast desperately wanted a child, but couldn't adopt through legal channels. Maybe they were too old. Maybe they had criminal records. Maybe they simply didn't want to wait years on an adoption list. So they found someone who could get them a child. Someone connected to a criminal network that specialized in procuring children for wealthy couples. The woman in the bandana was probably part of that network. A professional. Someone who'd maybe done this before. She was given an assignment: acquire a young child. Not an infant, too difficult to care for during transport. Not an older child, too likely to remember their real family. But a young child, 5 to 7 years old. Old enough to be relatively independent. Young enough to adapt. Maybe she specifically targeted Puerto Rican or Hispanic families. Knowing the language barrier would make it harder for them to report the crime effectively. Or maybe she just watched that park for days, looking for the right opportunity, and Luis and Roger happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Either way, she acquired the product, transported it across the country, probably by plane, delivered it to the paying customers, received her payment, and moved on to her next job. Cold, businesslike, professional. Luis wasn't a child to her. He was a commodity. The couple who raised Luis, the adoptive parents whose names have never been made public, are also dead now. Both of them, gone for years. So there's no way to question them about their role in this. Were they knowing participants in a kidnapping? Did they specifically request that someone steal a child for them? Or were they victims too, in a sense? Told by an illegal adoption broker that Luis was an orphan? That his parents had died and he needed a home? That this was a legitimate adoption, just handled outside normal channels to expedite the process? We'll never know. The truth died with them. And in some ways, it doesn't matter. Because regardless of whether they knew Luis was stolen, regardless of their intentions, they participated in a crime that destroyed another family. Antonia spent 54 years in agony because of them. Roger carried guilt his entire life because of them. An entire extended family was traumatized because of them. But Luis also carries complicated feelings about them. Because they raised him. They were his parents for 70 years. They were there for his first day of school, his graduation, his wedding, the births of his children. They supported him through Vietnam. They were proud when he became a firefighter. They loved him in their way. How do you reconcile that? How do you hold both truths at once? That someone can genuinely love you while also having stolen you from people who loved you first. Luis doesn't talk much publicly about his feelings toward his adoptive parents. But in the few interviews he's given, his tone is measured. Careful. He doesn't condemn them, but he doesn't defend them either. He just acknowledges that the situation is complicated in ways most people will never understand. The legal situation remains murky. The Oakland PD and FBI are keeping the criminal investigation open, at least in name. If new evidence emerges, if someone comes forward with information, they'll pursue it. But realistically, everyone knows that's not going to happen. Too much time has passed. Too many people involved are dead. The woman in the bandana is probably a skeleton in an unmarked grave somewhere. The truth about who she was and why she did it is probably lost forever. And maybe that has to be okay. Maybe the closure the family needed wasn't about catching the perpetrator or understanding her motivations. Maybe it was just about knowing that Luis was alive, knowing that he's okay, knowing that Antonia's faith was justified. Sometimes, in cases like this, the questions that remain are less important than the answers we do get. And the Albino family got the most important answer of all. Luis came home. But there's one more thing I need to tell you. One more twist in this already impossible story. Because while the criminal investigation may never be solved, while the woman in the bandana may never be identified, there's still one question that haunts everyone involved. Were there others? Was Luis the only child this network took? Or were there more? Other children, stolen from other parks, transported to other states, given to other couples who wanted babies and didn't care where they came from? If the woman in the bandana was a professional, if this was a business, if there was a network, then Luis probably wasn't the only victim. Somewhere out there might be other 75-year-olds living under false identities, with absolutely no idea they were stolen as children. Other families who never stopped searching. Other mothers who died without knowing their children survived. The FBI is looking into this. Quietly, carefully. They're reviewing other unsolved child abductions from the 1940s and 50s, looking for patterns. Children who disappeared from California and were never found. Children from Hispanic or immigrant families. Children who fit the same profile as Luis. And they're encouraging people to take DNA tests, to upload their results to genealogy databases. Because if there are other victims out there, DNA might be the only way to find them. Imagine that. Imagine being 75 years old, taking a DNA test for fun, and discovering that your entire identity is a lie. That you have a family you never knew existed. That you were stolen as a child. It sounds like fiction, but it happened to Luis. Which means it could have happened to others. How many Luises are out there, living normal lives, with no idea they're missing children? How many Antonias died without knowing their children survived? How many Rogers carried guilt to their graves? We may never know. But the Albino family's story proves that it's never too late to find out. Never too late for a miracle. Never too late for hope to be rewarded. So what do we do with this story? This impossible, beautiful, heartbreaking, miraculous story? I think we hold it up as proof that hope matters. That persistence matters. That refusing to accept the unacceptable can sometimes, against all odds, lead to miracles. Antonia Albino searched for 54 years. She died without getting her answer. But her granddaughter inherited her determination, carried it forward, and finally, brought Luis home. Roger Albino carried guilt for 73 years. He died thinking he'd failed his brother. But he lived long enough to learn he was wrong. Long enough to hug Luis one more time. Long enough to find peace. Luis Albino lived 73 years as someone else. He lost his childhood, his identity, his biological family, and decades he can never get back. But he found them again. Found his roots. Found his real name. Found people who'd been searching for him his entire life. And Alida Alquin? She took a DNA test for fun. Just out of curiosity. Just to see what it would say. And she solved one of the longest-running missing child cases in American history. That's the power of modern technology combined with human determination. That's what happens when science meets stubbornness. That's what miracles look like in the 21st century. Luis is still alive, still processing everything, still building relationships with his California family while maintaining relationships with his East Coast family, still going to therapy, still trying to figure out who he is, the person he was for 73 years, or the person he should have been. The answer, I think, is both. He's both. He's the Marine who served in Vietnam and the little boy who was stolen from a park. He's the firefighter who saved lives and the missing child who was searched for decades. He's the grandfather with 2 families and the son his mother never stopped believing in. He's Luis Armando Albino. And whoever else he became along the way. The case has sparked a renewed interest in other cold missing person cases. Families across the country are taking DNA tests, hoping for their own miracles. Law enforcement agencies are reopening old files, looking at them through the lens of genetic genealogy. Because if Luis could be found after 73 years, who else might be out there waiting to be discovered? The Oakland Police Department keeps that grainy photograph from 1951 in their solved cases file now. Two brothers, frozen in time. But clipped to it is a new photograph, taken in June 2024. Two elderly men, embracing in front of a house in Stanislaus County. Proof that the impossible sometimes happens. That the coldest cases can sometimes be solved. That hope, however foolish it seems, is sometimes rewarded. And somewhere, wherever she is, Antonia Albino knows she was right. She was right all along. Her son was alive. Her faith was justified. Her love was stronger than time and distance, and even death itself. Te amo, mijo, she'd said every night for 54 years. I love you, my son. Sei que volverás a casa. I know you'll come home. And she was right. It took 73 years. It took a global pandemic and a DNA test, and a determined granddaughter and the power of modern science. But Luis came home. The ghost came home. Thank you for staying with me through this incredible journey. If this story moved you, if it gave you chills, if it made you believe in miracles or hope or the power of a mother's love, please show your support. Hit that like button. Leave a comment telling me what you thought. Have you ever taken a DNA test? What did you find? And subscribe to Buried Secret Media with all notifications turned on, because I'm dedicated to bringing you more stories like this. Stories that prove truth is stranger than fiction. Stories that remind us why we should never give up, no matter how impossible the situation seems. Because Luis Armando Albino's story proves that sometimes the impossible is just the improbable waiting 73 years to happen. This is Buried Secret Media. Keep searching, keep hoping, keep believing, because you never know when the ghost will come home.